Hey, hey, Wash.
Hey, we did it.
We did. How are you?
um, I'm good. How about you?
Yeah, how are you? It's a cold winter day, but it's nice. I'm glad we're doing this today.
Remind me, where do you live
I'm in
again?
I'm in
Okay,
Chicago.
cool. I'm
Yeah.
in Colorado. I'm kind of I'm kind of astonished that we have five friends joining us. I I was not going to be surprised if like it was just you and me talking because you and I don't have like much of an Instagram
Yeah,
presence.
yeah. I hardly use it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Well, okay, so we're here for like 20 minutes. This is just like a fun, quick conversation, and neither of us are like the moderator. We're told to just talk. So we're gonna introduce our books, right? Like I'm Vauhini Vara, and this is my book. This is Salvaged.
Sorry. I'm gonna quickly grab my book. I'm Nishanth Injam. I'm the author of Best Possible Experience.
Um, cool. Okay. So this is my first Instagram live that I've actually initiated, and I think my second ever.
Okay. I think this is my
um,
first ever Instagram live.
yeah, it feels so weird. I loved your book again, Nishan's book, The Best Possible Experience. I had heard about this book so much before I actually read it. It kept like popping up on all these lists of books to read, and I'm so glad I did. It's gorgeous. It's original, which is like my highest praise for a book, right? Like it's a book that is unlike any other book I've read. Um, we weirdly, I feel like we have a lot of overlapping experiences as well as like subject matter interests that we both write about. So that'll be fun to talk about. So I'm just going to start by with the first story in the book, which is like the most I feel like is like the story in the book that's least like all the other stories in your book, the bus. Interestingly, I was just so I don't want to give it away. It's like it's got some horror vibes. It's got some like you know not of our conventional realist world vibes, and it's also in the story the narrator's brother has died, and interestingly in my first story the narrator's brother has died. You and I both don't have brothers who have died, but we do have other people in our lives who have died, and I'm curious. I was interested in asking you about like the value for you as a writer or as a person of like doing what's sometimes referred to as like telling it slant, like coming at something that is part of your personal experience but like without directly writing non-fictionally, right, about like the loss you experienced, the thing that happened to you. So maybe we start there.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Thank you for saying such kind things about my book. I'm so honored, and I absolutely admired your book as well. So I'll before I geek out your book, I want to respond to your question. So I I did notice that similarity when I read your book as well. When I read the first story, I think it's for me. The attraction is in the sense of like having this phantom figure who is like me or a version of me,
Mm.
and then the version who died. So it's for me that works as a really nice break, you
Mm.
know. And I also wrote the story because I noticed that there weren't a lot of siblings in my other stories, and I thought, this would, it would be nice to have another story with siblings, and so that was definitely part of it. And to be honest, the entire story sort of came to me in a dream. Rarely happens,
Like you
so
dreamed the story
I did,
basically.
I did, and then I woke up and wrote it in
Whoa.
in 3 days or something like that.
By the way, I see a couple of my nieces and nephews here. So, hey guys, I see you. I feel like they just like saw that I was doing an Instagram live in the moment because I'm not usually on Instagram, and they were like, "Let's see what our
Yeah.
aunt is up to." Um, uh,
And also because when
yeah.
you're writing about um, a loss, and there's also different ways to write about this loss of a sort of a self, and I felt like I needed to open up um, an avenue for dialogue between my present self and my
Mm.
past self. And I felt that I could do that with this idea of a ghost.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's such a strange story. I like did not see any of it coming. And it's so powerful. And then I finished the story and was like, oh, that's the kind of book this is. And then the rest of the book deals with similar subject matter, but like
Uh,
not in
uh,
that way.
yeah,
Very for those of you here who like spooky things, the first story in this book is for you. Yeah, that's interesting what you say. It's funny that like one of the reasons was a practical consideration, like you thinking, oh, I don't have many stories in this collection with siblings, because I think non-writers, anybody here who's a non-writer might not know that for us as writers, like sometimes it comes down to those practical things. So for me in my first story, honestly, I my sister died, and honestly I was like, well, there are a lot of stories in this book that like have references to sisters who died. I've got to mix things up a little. um
yeah,
but then also there's like a kind of older guy character in the first book, and I first the character in at first in my first story it was a sister who died, but there's this kind of older guy character who's sort of important to the first story, and I realized that older guy character would sort of like have this added resonance or meaning if the narrator's older brother died and not sister. So yeah, it's funny. I'm teaching a nonfiction class right now, so it's like funny to think about the things that we
I
can
know.
do in fiction that just aren't available to us in
Yeah,
nonfiction.
totally. Yeah. I would love to ask you a question. I mean, I know that about your stories and the way you think about stories and how it has changed. I see that you've written these stories over a period of many years, more than a decade, I believe. So how do you think your like aesthetic has changed over the years? Like, do you? Because I see in some stories that like you have this Rachel Kuskian sort of mode of character interrogation, reportage, and in others like which are there's like scenes with more conventional elements and that convey the texture of lived experience. And you're equally brilliant at both of these different modes, and I'm curious to know like whether you distrust traditional approaches to narrative, and how has your aesthetic changed over the course of the years that you were writing this collection?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned. I know which story you mean. I think it's
Yeah.
the hormone hypothesis
Yes.
that you describe as having like Rachel Cusk like vibes. Rachel, for those of you who don't know Rachel Cusk here, Rachel Cusk being this writer who like will write these whole novels that are just made up of a character's conversations with random people. Um, so that story, the hormone hypothesis, like it's got this conversation at the center. That is the most recent story I wrote, which somehow I feel like maybe you guessed. That's the newest story in the collection. It's interesting, because for me, what I think I became a writer and became interested in stories through, in part through my parents, and especially my mom, who when I was a kid would just like tell these long convoluted stories that would like meander from here to there to here to there, and not necessarily follow like what we think of in like Western European and US culture as like a traditional arc, where like you set a character on a path and then something big happens and it affects the character and changes them, and then there's sort of like a you go down the hill from there. um that wasn't the way my mom would tell stories, and yet the assumption is like, oh, if there's not something, it's not like a question in the story that the reader is trying to answer, it's going to get boring and it's not a real story. Like I still was fascinated by her stories, and when I learned to I learned to write by reading stories that had like a more traditional in the sort of US and Western European imagination arc. And I think my earlier stories tend to follow an arc that looks more like that, because that's how I learned to write. And then more recently, as I've gotten more confident, I think as a writer, I've sort of like thought to myself again about like what drew me to writing and stories in the first place, and I have become interested, and it's in that story, and it's sort of like the way I'm now starting to write a little bit more, like in just figuring out how to like put on the page the kind of storytelling that I grew up with, that I appreciate, and that I think like is the kind of storytelling that we hear all the time from like our friends and loved ones and stuff, but like isn't like I'm just curious about like how you can put that on the page in a way that's as compelling as like the storytelling from your friends. But I wanted to ask you that relates to something I wanted to ask you, but I wanted to ask you actually. I think I read in an interview that your story, and I think it might be my favorite story in the collection, your story, The Zamindar's
Yeah.
Watch, was maybe the last story you wrote in the collection. Is that right?
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah.
Um, which was interesting to me in part because like a lot of your stories deal with loss. And I understand that you had a significant loss actually after you wrote some of the stories about loss, but before you wrote that one. And the specific thing I was curious to ask you about was how your experience of like this really significant loss in your life changed the way you write about loss, whether like you went back and revised earlier stories about loss because you were like, oh, I didn't have it right in that draft, now I need to change it, or like how that changed, if at all.
It I did change the ending to Math of Living story as well. I hadn't known how to end it, and then when my mom died, I knew that was the end. And
Yeah.
so apart from that, I didn't do a lot of I didn't have to do a whole lot of revision for other stories. I felt like I had a sense of how devastating loss could be already. I mean, even if I didn't experience it as intimately as I did. But with the Zemindar's Watch, I was sort of floundering for good couple of years, maybe more than that. I thought my life as a writer was over. I know some of my friends in the chat have, they know the story. They I just didn't believe in words anymore. Because it felt to me like that all of the things that I was writing, I thought I was writing to prevent, not to prevent, but as a way of like um, putting up a wall against this onrushing grief that life can bring. But it didn't seem like words had the power to sort of heal, not necessarily heal, but at least even soothe me.
Yeah.
And it took time for me to like move past that, and then try to figure out a way to still use language as a way to find meaning.
Yeah.
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 and
I
it,
mean, I relate to that a lot too myself.
and I think the Zamindar's Watch is perhaps also the most American story
Hmm.
out of all the ones we've got. Uh,
How so? How would you? What makes you see it
it,
that way?
it's the most American in terms of form.
Mm.
Because all of the emotion is sort of held back until the final. There's a sentence in the story. It's about the I think the last sentence or the penultimate sentence. It's about um, the one where the narrator says, she wants to know how to live her life. She wants her mom to tell her how to live this life. So I think that the entire story is sort of built around that sentence.
Yeah. Yeah.
At least the emotion
Yeah.
of it, even if there are other ideas wrapped in that in the watch and in everything,
Hmm.
but the emotion sort of comes from that, from the power of from that from that longing.
Yeah.
So it's very efficient. I know it works, and it's. I mean, I'm not putting the American storytelling form down by any means. I just think that it was all, I couldn't manage to write a story like that. Partly because I had all these, because I was coming from India, and I had this.
Mm.
I didn't feel like I understood the form enough to do that, and I had my own interpretation of the short story form, and and it and by the time I wrote that story, I've been living in the U.S. for almost a decade, and so, maybe it's partly the time that allowed me to sort of get it.
That's so interesting, right?
Yeah,
It's almost like we went in different directions. Like I grew up with the American form,
yeah,
and then in the last story in my collection, I'm like sort of like using trying something different that is somewhat influenced probably by Telugu storytelling or oral storytelling forms, right? Because like I mentioned my mom as being a kind of like sort of inspiring that way of
Yeah.
storytelling in me. And then you lived in the US for a long time before using like what you're calling the American form in a story.
Yeah.
Um, but what, oh, sorry, it's your turn.
No, I think it's partly because I've resisted it because I've always wanted m- stories to sort of feel full of emotion, and I didn't want to. I didn't want to write a story. I mean, I've never had to actually write a story until at least until without. Sorry, let me backtrack for a minute. I've never had to write a story without knowing where the story would lead. I would always come to the page trying to transpose a feeling that I cannot sort of express. So it's the feeling was always sort of the primary driver, and I wanted to. I was using stories as a way as a vessel for
Yeah.
that. Um,
Yeah.
and so I was interested, and so naturally I was interested in making the largest vessels possible within the span of short stories,
Yeah.
and so which didn't always necessarily translate to success or whatever you call it. People would think about it and think, oh, this is maybe too emotional, or this is not.
Mm.
It didn't quite fit American short story form.
Like the emotion is sort of
Exactly.
heightened throughout. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not. There's no pinprick at the end. It's more
Yeah.
sustained.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
I think I think the thing I that like moved me most and I admired most, and that like when I say that story was my favorite, it's interesting that maybe like indicating my own sort of ingrained expectations of stories, right? But also it was like the way in which like it sort of expectations kind of turned
sure. Yeah,
a couple of times in the story. Like there were these moments where you thought one thing was going to happen based on like our sort of conventional understanding of like power dynamics and social dynamics, and then something different happens, and that happens at least two times in the story.
yeah. I'm glad, I'm glad you enjoyed that. I mean, I don't want to go back to that. I have so many questions I want to ask you. So about your collection, I love that you're interested in the aftermath. Like people, I think Danielle Evans has a quote in her blurb. She says, you're interested in the aftermath, and and it that constituting the break itself.
Yeah.
And like in the quieter moments where fault lines are visible between characters and in families, and also you're also interested in the shapeless territories of post grief, and in what can be salvaged from these places. And I'm curious to know, what do you think about your collection and like where you're going to go next? Like, do you think you'll ever be done with foraging in these places? Do you think you'll ever be done sort of with grief in a sense?
Hmm. I mean, I think as humans, in a way, we're never done with grief,
Right.
As a writer, I will say, I mean, I think like that sort of like visceral, immediate feeling of grief that is clear in the pages of this book has something to do with the fact that I started these stories. I guess I started these stories around 7 years after my sister died. And now it's been more than 20 years. And so certainly grief changes. And I think like my current experience of grief is different from the experience of grief that's experienced by some of the characters in the stories, for whom like who are just like right in the aftermath of grief. And it's not just of sort of like the loss of other people, but various kinds of losses. So I think like being in a different phase myself, I think like that will probably manifest in my future writing. I do think something that I will always be interested in my work is like writing about the relationships between people and among people, like writing stories and books where like those relationships are the most important thing, rather than like the kind of like internal experience or change within one person. I think like that's always been most interesting to me. I think just like as a person, not necessarily as a writer. And so I think that's going to be kind of my lifelong thing.
Yeah.
And I guess I'll ask you, I don't even know what time it is, but I feel like we're coming toward the end. So I kind of wanted to ask you the same question, because I love that question about like just our evolution as writers. Like we talked about the beginning, our path from the beginning to now. And what about for you? Where do you go from here?
I think I'm still interested in grief, and I'm interested in inverting grief.
Yeah.
In transforming it into sort of for lack of a better term, into a stronger soul force. Uh,
Yeah.
I, uh, I, I don't know that. Um, I don't know that I will write another story that's purely about grief. For me, I think I've lost interest in sort of just articulating
Yeah.
grief, because I feel like I've done that already to a degree,
Mm-hmm.
and so now I want to see if I can push grief into something
Yeah.
else now, and I don't have language for what it could be yet.
Yeah.
But maybe that's part of the journey in figuring out how I can um, use it to find new lands. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
And like if we knew what form that was going to take, it wouldn't be interesting enough to write about, right? The whole
yeah,
point of writing is to figure it out.
yeah.
How are we on time? I just realized, like, how do you see the time
Um,
when you're on one?
I think we're at 20
Okay.
minutes,
Okay.
but yeah, I mean, I would love to chat more. I mean, I have like other questions too as well,
I
but
know we
yeah,
just,
yeah,
as so people who are here
yeah,
know, we have this whole like Google Doc of a million questions. I maybe we can like have a longer conversation sometime, because there are truly like so many things I want to ask you about also. But I don't know. Thanks
yeah,
for.
yeah.
It's
This is
weird
great.
because there's no like. I keep like acting host like because I initiated the
I,
Instagram.
yeah, we're, I can close it up.
Okay. Okay. Perfect.
uh, so yeah, thank you again for doing this. I really admired your collection, and just how the whole the arc of the collection is a way. It's it starts from I all I have is you people to we were here, and the journey of it.
Yeah.
I saw the whole collection as a beautiful act of witnessing, of holding all the things and all the selves that we once were,
Mm.
holding that close. And yeah, thank you for taking the time to speak with me. I'll hope I chat with you again some other time.
Yes, me too. And thank you for saying all those things. And I would just say it's funny that you describe my book that way, because I think your book is largely about, we're concerned with similar subject matter, and I just found your book beautiful, and the level of the sentence and the paragraph and the whole thing, and experimental in some places, in many places, sometimes in stealthy ways, sometimes in overt ways. And I just feel so lucky to have encountered it, and everybody here should read it if you haven't already. Okay.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye.